Well, we're now in part two of the first 17 verses of John's Gospel. In part one of the video, we looked at what it means to live or abide in Jesus and what Jesus meant when he said to his disciples that they should abide in him because he is the true vine. He is the true place where God is working out his purposes. He has taken over from the nation of Israel as the place where God is doing his saving work. And what we get to now is loving like Jesus. That's the second thing we're looking at today. Loving like Jesus. And we're going to look at the rest of those verses through to verse 17 of chapter 15. Now, I don't know if you remember as a child or whether with your own children, where the child comes home and says to the parent, so-and-so won't play with me, or so-and-so won't be my friend unless I do this or say this or do the other, or give them $1 for their lunch money or something like that. They won't be my friend. And you get a bit steamed up about that, don't you? And you say to them, well, you just do what you like, and if they don't want to be your friend, well, that's fine. You just don't be their friend because they say that you should do something. Now, at primary school level, that's probably a little bit innocent, but you can deal with it. But it gets more complicated, doesn't it, as a child gets older and gets into the peer pressure of high school. And then you think about how relationships spread out from that as you get older, and how there are so many transactional relationships where it feels like the friendship is based on you doing something for the person, or the relationship is very much quid pro quo. You put the coin in and the result comes out the other end. And in this passage of the Bible, it would seem at first blush that Jesus is being like that manipulative friend when he's speaking to his disciples. There he is on the last night before the cross, and he says this in verse 14 of John 15. Have a look at it with me. You are my friends if you do what I command you. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Now, the verse beforehand is also a little bit strange given what we know from what some of the rest of the New Testament talks about. Listen to the verse beforehand, verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Now, obviously, in times of war, we use that verse to talk about the heroic sacrifice of a man for his mates in the trenches or on the open field of battle. But it sort of flies in the face, doesn't it, of Romans 5:8, for example, which says that God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When we were God's enemies, God showed the greatest love he could possibly show us by Christ dying for us. Not when we were God's friends, but when we were his enemies. It almost seems to be watering down it here, doesn't it? That no greater love than in dying for friends. So what's going on in this passage? Well, Jesus has moved from talking about living in Jesus to loving like Jesus. And as we said, it sounds like he's operating at that transactional level of relationships that we're so desperate to avoid as we grow up in life. But the key verse is verse 9. Have a look at verse 9 with me. Jesus says to the disciples, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. In other words, in the same way. And how does the Father love the Son? Well, if you go back in John's Gospel, which has a lot to say about love, you read these words from Jesus in John chapter 3, verse 35. Or from John, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. And then in John 5:20, you read these words, for the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. In other words, it's a long way from being that transactional kind of relationship. The Father's love towards the Son, as demonstrated in chapter 3 and chapter 5, and giving meaning to chapter 15, the Father's love is generous, selfless, intimate, trusting, entrusting, and empowering. It's a world away from those transactional relationships. And Jesus here is saying that is exactly the way he is going to love the disciples. In fact, verse 15 says that everything that the Father told Jesus, Jesus is now telling them. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I've called you friends, For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. He is completely open with them. He's not holding anything back. If you think about the depth of that the Father, eternal God, from eternity past, has revealed everything to eternal Son, and now Jesus is going to reveal that stuff to his disciples. And what are they in turn to do? It says, abide in this love. That's what they're to do. They are to love in exactly the same way. Generous, selfless, intimate, trusting, entrusting, and empowering. And that all leads to the most famous of the love verses in John's Gospel, perhaps in the Bible. This is my commandment, verse 12, says Jesus, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You see, although the disciples are Jesus' friends now, it didn't start off that way, did it? Verse 16 virtually proves that. Jesus says to them, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide. You did not choose me, says Jesus, but I chose and appointed you. And the disciples are sitting there in the upper room on that last night before the cross, listening to this, reminiscing about the last 3 years of their lives, turned upside down by Jesus, who said, follow me, to people who weren't going to follow him, who has shown them love and compassion and taught them and brought them along with him. Come with me, he says. You didn't choose me, I chose you. They realize that Jesus has swept them up into the purposes of God, not because of their love for him or their choosing of him, but the other way around, because of his love for them and his choosing of them. They are not just servants of a master anymore, they are friends. Folks, we talk about being a Jesus follower in our Christian culture today. But to be a Jesus friend is truly what we're called to be, isn't it? To do what Jesus asks us to do. And most explicitly in this passage, what does Jesus ask his friends to do? Love one another. This is my commandment. Love one another as I have loved you, which in turn is as the Father has loved the Son. Costly, sacrificial, intimate, and serving. If you're looking for the beautiful fruit of the vine that Israel was supposed to be, but was not, that's where it is. God has always been looking for that kind of fruit on the vine. He's been looking for the fruit of people who love in that way. And that's the test of whether we truly abide in him. Now I want to stop there, and we'll finish this section. And perhaps you might want to pray before you go on to look at some of these questions. And then I'm going to just give you the questions now that you can ask in your groups together. And 3 short questions you can discuss. 1, do our lives together reflect that we are Jesus' friends? In other words, where is the fruit of love that we can point to in providence? Secondly, if you're feeling unloving towards a fellow brother or sister in Christ in our church, what in this passage provides the antidote to that poison? And third, what does it mean to have been chosen by God rather than to choose God? And just a final thought. Twice in this passage, Jesus calls on his disciples to ask God for something in his name. How might you, as you finish praying, be shaped by the twin commands of living in Jesus and loving like Jesus in your prayer life? How could your prayers be shaped by those twin commands? I hope you find this helpful and that it helps us bear fruit for God's kingdom.